Well, we made it, folks. We made it to the end of the road together. I guess for the last time for this Maple Leaf Route webinar series. Good evening, and for those living west of the Ontario borders, good late afternoon. My name is Eric Story. I'm the Outreach Manager at the Laurier Centre for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies in Waterloo, Ontario, coming to you from my swelteringly hot 15th floor apartment in Kitchener. Now, I and the rest of the folks at the Laurier Military Centre, as well as our gracious and untiring partners throughout this entire series, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, the Juno Beach Center Association, and the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, would like to welcome you all to the eighth and final installment of the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history of the land in which the Laurier Military Center resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also solve conflicts peacefully. 80 some years later, in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and British Crown following the American Revolution, and the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source just north of Orangeville today to Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and acknowledging their presence in the past and present reminds everyone of the responsibilities we all hold as treaty people. Now, I'm sure many of you are sick and tired of hearing the same kind of preamble that I give to this series, so I won't inflict any more pain on you. I will perhaps just give us a recap of what we've been able to accomplish since May. As we promised over the last several months, we have been reflecting on and asking new questions about the battles of Normandy. Of course, our first event, we explored the D-Day landing with Terry Kopp. We then moved to the advance towards Caen, the city's taking by Canadian troops, and eventually the closing of the Falaise Gap with Mark Milner and Lee Windsor. Afterwards, we made a few pit stops along the way, as we normally do on a battlefield tour, examining the role of Canadian Red Cross women with Sarah Glassford and Allied Air Support's impact on morale with Alex Fitzgerald Black. A month ago, Carolyn Demore provided some much needed balance to an overly English Canadian narrative of the battles of Normandy, speaking about the role and experience of French Canadian infantry battalions. And 2 weeks ago, Matt Barrett gave us a brilliant talk on the curious case of Lieutenant Reginald Woods and the larger question of soldiers' discipline and military justice. Tonight, our speaker will reflect on what we've learned over the course of this spring and summer, evaluate the role and performance of 1st Canadian Army at Normandy, and ponder how we might remember those who fell while fighting there. But before I turn it over to the speaker tonight, I'd like to graciously ask you just one last time to please consider donating to the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association. The pandemic has been challenging for many cultural and educational organizations around the world, and as we turn towards the 2022 tour season and begin to prepare for it, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association needs you more than ever to help keep the memory alive of those who fought and died overseas. This month, the Juno Beach Center Association is promoting the Remembrance Day race. I'm sure many of you have heard this if you've tuned into the last couple of webinars. For only $50, you will receive a racing kit that includes a medal, a Lancaster bomber pin, Remembrance Day flag, a poppy seeds, and even a racing bib. Participants can choose from one of 3 historically significant distance options: the Strong Point at 1,500 meters, Juno Beach at 8 kilometers, and Remembrance at 21.1 kilometers, which I think is half of a marathon. And fundraise for the Juno Beach Center while they walk or run in order for a chance to win a variety of prizes. Join the Juno Beach Center's journey of remembrance and gratitude as they honor the men and women who served during the Second World War. Now, of course, as I've been asking you and telling you where to go, you can donate to both the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association by going to our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and clicking donate at the top of the page. I'll make sure to include that in the chat function at the bottom of your window. Now, again, I just have two more quick housekeeping reminders for you before I turn it over to the speaker tonight. I haven't quite turned it on yet, but I am going to be turning on the closed captioning shortly. And if you find that distracting, you can actually toggle it on and off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. So do so if you are finding it distracting. Last thing, if questions come to you at any point during the presentation, this isn't like a formal kind of in-person event, please enter your question into the Q&A function again at the bottom of your screen at any point. Whenever that question pops in your mind, just throw it right into that Q&A function. And when you do so, please let us know where you're coming from, because we love to know where all of our audience is tuning in from tonight. I'd now like to turn it over to our final speaker for the Maple Leaf Route webinar series, my very gracious co-host throughout this entire series, Dr. Geoff Hayes. He's professor in the Department of History at the University of Waterloo, and his most recent book, Careers Lieutenants, Inventing the Canadian Junior Army Officer, 1939 to 45, won the C.P. Stacy Prize for Best Book in Canadian Military History, and is available tonight for a 20% discount for anyone interested in purchasing a copy. I will make sure to include all of that information for you so you know where to find it and how to enter that code, again, at the bottom of your screen in the chat function. Dr. Geoff Hayes is also a director of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, who has co-led with Brigadier General David Patterson many student tours to Northwest Europe over the past 20 years. And I will now turn it over to Geoff. It is his floor for the next hour, and we hope you enjoy your time with us one last time.
Eric, you shut me out. Oh, have you?
Have I? Give me a second. What a way to end, right?
That's okay.
Okay, give me 1 second. No, you should be able to start your video.
It says I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. Oh, there we are. There we are. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for the kind introduction. And I'm not Mary-Eve Vinecourt, I'm sorry to say, but I'm filling in a little bit for Mary-Eve, and will, I hope, change things around a little bit so that we can perhaps talk about the memory of the Normandy campaign on the virtual tour that I want to give you over the next few minutes. Before I do that, though, I want to do one quick thing. We've been making you open your wallets and all these marvelous things, and I just want to make reference to what I think is a really good cause. And I hope Steve Douglas isn't too embarrassed by this, but Steve is a really good guy. He's from Kitchener, Ontario, as a matter of fact. And but we all know him because he runs the British Grenadier Bookshop in Ypres, Belgium. And Ypres has, of course, faced the same effects of COVID that we've all faced. And so it has obviously cut into Steve's remarkable career as a battlefield tour guide, especially. And as a result, the Laurier Center, CanadianMilitaryHistory.ca, you'll go right to it, and you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a Help the British Grenadier Bookshop. If you can spare a few dollars, the friends of Steve have tried to create a GoFundMe page, and it's well on its way to making its goal and to keep Steve in business. And I think that all of us who've been to Steve's shop and have benefited from Steve's work, he's a great photographer too, has been involved in so many, particularly First World War initiatives, photographing all the graves of First World War veterans, for instance. A wonderful book with Eric McGeer that he's published. I would highly recommend those works and would urge you to give Steve a little bit of help over the next little while. So Steve, I did that. You're probably going to be mad at me, but so what? Okay. So what I want to talk about tonight is, as I say, a battlefield tour, but a slightly different one. And I'll go to my other set of slides. Sorry, bear with me. That. There. And I want to provide a bit of a summary, but I also want to try to speak to some old questions and some new questions about the Canadians in the Normandy campaign. And I want to do that by starting off with a day in history, the 25th of August, 1944, 77 years ago today. And I want us to think briefly about what those days might represent. And then I want us to think about how the euphoria of those days has perhaps not been as well reflected in our official accounts of the Canadians in Normandy as we might think. We've talked over the course of our time about the Canadian Army official history by Colonel C.P. Stacy, and particularly the volume, The Victory Campaign, which describes in great detail the Normandy campaign and Canada's involvement in it. And in particular, that balance sheet, a chapter that tries to assess the Canadian role in the Normandy campaign. And I want to talk to that because it does come up indeed, and it sort of still tends to dominate the way in which we understand the Canadians in the Normandy campaign. But I also think, and I think this kind of inspired me on the last book, and it's inspiring me on my present research, which I'll give you some hints about over the next few minutes. Stacy also dropped some really interesting hints about other directions where the official history might have gone and other directions that historians are starting to follow. And in some respects, in the discussion that I have about morale today, I'm way behind. Lots of other historians have talked about it. And I will, I hope, be able to highlight some of those histories, particularly recent works that are worth looking at in the recent publications. Okay, so then you can see that I'm going to take you on a tour. And this tour, I hope, is not only going to talk about some of the Stacy matters, particularly about the performance of the Canadians, but it's also mindful, and I must admit, I wasn't able to attend Lee Windsor's presentation back at the end of June, but I watched it quite recently. So Lee is in the back of my head here a little bit. He is a brilliant historian, is a great teacher, particularly of teachers. Really put some new ideas into my head and ones that I think we really do need to ask. We do have all sorts of new questions to ask, and I hope we can do that as we make our stops along our virtual tour in the Normandy campaign. We'll end with a short visit to Benny-sur-Mer, which is how we so often end our battlefield tours. And I hope we can leave with a sense of the Canadian accomplishment and also a sense of some of the new questions that we might want to ask. This is a map. I hope it's not as well reproduced as I would have liked, but that's no fault of the map makers. This is from the Project 44 people who've done a really quite remarkable job in mapping the progress of the Canadians throughout both the Normandy campaign and now throughout Northwest Europe. It's really quite a remarkable project. You can see this at project44.ca, as I've shown in the lower left corner. And this map gives us a nice sense of how the battlefront has moved over the course of the campaign. You can see that I've scrolled to the 25th of August, 1944, and you can get a sense now that the Battle of Normandy, 77 years ago, is over. That the Normandy Peninsula then has, the lines have moved well beyond Normandy, and now you can see that particularly with the Canadians up here are starting to approach the Seine River, and the Americans are moving to the south. It's like an immense starfire has exploded with these armies moving out of Normandy after just 80 days. I think it's 80 days between 6 June 1944 and the 25th of August 1944. And you can see here that great kind of salient that's heading towards Paris. Today, 77 years ago, Paris was liberated by elements of the General Leclerc's Armored Division and the 4th U.S. Infantry Division. So there is an enormous sense of relief that not only is Paris, but soon all of France will be liberated from the occupation that began when France surrendered in June of 1940. So all of which then is a nice way to reflect a little bit on the sense of how the Canadians see themselves. And one of the great things about this project, the Project 44, is that they have really quite a remarkable body of war diary material as well. So let's take a quick look at what the war diaries, the daily accounts from each units, or a selected amount of units, are saying on this day. Here's 4th Canadian Armored Division. It's just come into the line at the beginning of August. And I'll recommend a few good books to you that might well explore more about 4 Armored Division. But here's the entry. Divisional headquarters had another enjoyable day, receiving the adulation of the population, who commenced to bring rare old bottles of wine and beer to celebrate the liberation. So far, no untoward incidents have occurred. Of course, there would be 1 or 2 untoward incidents. Fort Garry Horse, part of 3rd Division, landed on D-Day 80 days before. It's a great one. The war diarist, likely the adjutant, gives a nice sense of the time. We're well on our way now, and all ranks began to catch the spirit of the chase. Now at last, after the long, hard Battle of Normandy, we seem to have cut loose, traveling towards Germany on the very highways which the Hun had boasted were his anti-invasion insurance. And now we are paying back our debt of hard-learned war knowledge. We were showing even Germany what it meant to be opposing a modern mechanized army. There's a lot of boasting there. There's a lot of pride. There is a great deal of celebration. The Canadians are on the move, and the Canadians feel, I think quite rightly, that they have played a crucial part. And that's really fascinating to see right from that time how quickly and how powerfully the Canadians feel about their victory. Now, I'm going to quote from several what are called censorship reports. And I think the censorship reports are really a fascinating source that other historians, Will Pratt and John Maker, have used to great success. And certainly Jonathan Fennell's book that has just come out to great reviews, called Fighting the People's War, draws a great deal from these censorship reports. Now, what are they? They were essentially created to try to ensure that the mail that British and Commonwealth soldiers wrote home was not going to share compromising information. And it seems clear that right from the get-go, they realized that all the instructions and all the threats and all the potential punishments prevented, to a large degree, soldiers from writing compromising information. But what they also found was that by reading this pretty broad cross-section of mail on a weekly basis, they would pull the mail bags off the trucks, throw them into the censor's office, and the censors would go at them, trying to figure out then what they thought the soldiers were telling their families back home in large measure, and trying to tell them, in effect, what their state of morale was. So these remarkable documents, as I say, have been well used, and Fennell's making great use of them. There are points at which I must say I disagree with the kind of conclusions that we're drawing, because I'm going to take a slightly different approach to the use of these kinds of letters. And I'll try to explain that as best I can in the next few minutes. What's remarkable then, as we move into this period of late August of 1944, is that the letters themselves confirm what the war diaries are saying. A typical extract penned by a sergeant with the Camerons of 2 Division was overflowing with national pride. You can well be proud of the Canadians, as we were part of the main effort that gave to the Allied commanders a certain tactical victory, which at present looks like a great step towards victory. I like that quote. So too did the censors, because it seems to suggest that the troops gave victory to the generals rather than the other way around. And historians since, including Stacy, including to some degree Fennell, have stressed the Army's problems and slow pace. Those at the time marveled at the strength and resilience of 1st Canadian Army. Indeed, that was the kind of question that started my own investigations as I started reading these morale reports, started trying to understand something about what morale meant. Jonathan Fennell has created, I think, a wonderful model that tries to anticipate, that sees morale as the great X factor that will determine, certainly in the British forces. His study of the British 8th Army is also well worth looking at. The study of how morale it will change the outcomes of battles. That 8th Army in the desert certainly sees a crisis in morale. And with the introduction of Montgomery in 1942, the training, the leadership, so many things begin to change. And the results, of course, are seen at El Alamein in October of 1942. The thesis then is extended then into the British and Commonwealth experience in his second book, Fighting the People's War. And in that book, he draws heavily upon the censorship or morale reports, as I'll call them now, to try to examine, and what he argues is a crisis in morale in 1st Canadian Army in early August of 1944. And he, in fact, cites another able British historian, Alan Alport, who says something seemed to be wrong with 1st Canadian Army in early August of 1944. And I'm struck then that those echoes very much come out of the Stacy verdict, come out of the balance sheet, out of the official version, which was published in 1960. And I've been talking a great deal, and by no means am I putting my dear colleague Roger Sardi on the spot, but I'm trying to understand from Roger's wonderful work about Stacy and the creation of the official histories, the kinds of problems and the kinds of ways in which he tried to create a fair and balanced assessment of the Canadians in the Normandy campaign. And yet, as I say, I think there's still a few hints there that I'd like to follow and develop to give you a sense of how Stacy perhaps created a verdict, but also hinted at a few other ways in which we might interpret the Canadian performance. Stacy recognized early on, as soon as he got to England in 1941, he was yet to be named the official historian, that the narrative of the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, was going to be an important measure by which the Canadians, by which Canada would measure the performance of the Army created after 1939. And I would argue that in many ways it offered a kind of mythical measure of performance that 1st Canadian Army could never quite match. We'll see that in a moment. For Stacy, or rather Charles Folks, who was a divisional commander in Normandy, he commanded the 2nd Division, and after the war became the chief of the general staff. It does seem clear that there are certain judgments being made in the post-war. And the problem, as Stacy argues, perhaps with Folks's assent, is not with the generals, certainly not with Montgomery, and it's certainly not with the soldiers, who he argues fought in the same way that their fathers had fought back a generation before. It's with the regimental officers. A proportion, that's the phrase, a proportion, a wonderfully suggestive but imprecise term, who failed to measure up in battle. Now, certainly Matthew Barrett's study that we heard a few weeks ago about Lieutenant Woods and his overturned court-martial may offer some credence to Stacy's assertions. But as I've tried to argue in that book, Career as Lieutenants, which I'm sure you're all buying right now, the reality is kind of complex. So I want to keep that in mind, the harsh assessment of the Canadians in the Canadian official history. And in some ways, as much as I think Terry and others have tried to create a new paradigm, as Lee put it a few weeks ago, the persistence of that official account is still there. And I'm curious, I guess, in light of that kind of euphoria that I've initially described that happened 77 years ago, as the Canadians began to move out of the Normandy campaign or out of the Normandy theater, how did this not get fully reflected in the Canadian official version? As it turns out, then, I guess I'm asking a different question. And I'm curious about it because we're always asking questions as historians, rather than asking what was wrong with 1st Canadian Army. That's a loaded question in many ways because it will allow us, or it will kind of narrow our focus. I'm curious about the broader implications of morale and how the Canadians understood it and how their own performance was affected by morale through the summer of 1944. And that question leans less on any kind of qualitative correlation, as Jonathan has talked about, between morale and the battlefield. Instead, it considers how Army officials and soldiers understood morale and their own role at the time. In fact, as I've discovered over the last couple of years, as I've sat in my office here and tried to understand this stuff as COVID swept all around us, was that the Canadian Army, like so many other armies, was preoccupied with morale. In 1942, one might argue, there was a crisis in morale in the Canadian Army. Its officials, in fact, went so far as to survey the troops, quite a remarkable thing for its time, and discovered that it had a serious morale problem. At the root of that problem was that 2/3 of surveyed soldiers were terribly worried about their families and that they weren't able to focus on their training and focus on their job as soldiers. And that, to me, is a remarkable insight that is worth exploring, but perhaps at another time. Soon after, the Army created a Directorate of Special Services. This was in May of 1942, just after the Army headquarters, the Canadian Army headquarters, was first set up in England under Andy McNaughton. So this Directorate of Special Services, driven by American initiatives, not British, was tasked with defining Army morale and trying to both define it and do something about it. Now, the whole process by which they come up with the definition is fascinating. I won't go into it. But here is the definition that they finally settled upon. Simple, direct, but fairly open. And it does seem to me that morale then was a pretty amorphous concept. We have all kinds of definitions of it now. Social scientists have provided that for us, but I'm more curious about how they understood it at the time. And morale, it seems, was a preoccupation. It was many things to many people. It occupied social scientists, public relations experts, padres, psychologists, social workers, filmmakers, and ultimately junior officers who were, after all, in charge of the morale of their men. The reports that were eventually created based upon this close reading of letters shows a pretty wide swath of matters relating to morale. It touched on mail, it touched on food, training, leadership, a view of the enemy, a view of themselves and why they were there. Morale was also highly gendered. Think of the emotional labor that Sarah Glassford's Red Cross women expended on the battlefields. We heard that presentation a few weeks ago. The same was true, as I've discovered, for the women who appeared in the Army show, an entertainment unit that traveled both through the Mediterranean and finally into Northwest Europe. The material was written by two young comics, graduates of the U of T, Johnny Wayne and Frank Schuster. Some of you may recognize those two names. I hope you do. And in those shows, they portrayed women as the wisecracking, but always smiling, sympathetic figures that thousands, literally tens of thousands of Canadian troops enjoyed seeing and listening to. So many of the letters highlighted by the censors noted how much the troops away from Canada for years liked to hear a female Canadian voice. Morale ultimately was national in scope. It was about being Canadian. It was about maintaining those links between England, the Mediterranean, and home, which of course reinforced the importance of mail. It was about ensuring that the Canadians saw themselves as Canadians, not just another British or imperial force. Morale was also, and this perhaps ties closely to the narrative of the CEF in the First World War, it was about creating a Canadian narrative that could rival that of their fathers a generation before. The Canadians then, it seems to me, had created in the euphoria that was 77 years ago, they had begun to create a narrative. And it was a narrative of success. It was a narrative in which the Canadian Army had won a great victory, a realization of that. But it was also a narrative, as I'll try to explain, that was soon clouded. And I think those implications will play out in both our understanding of the Army and our understanding of the official record. So I'm going to start taking you on the battlefield tour here. And I want you to think briefly about the way in which morale might well have played out. And it raises some issues that we've yet to discuss as historians who are concerned about, operational matters and so on. And it's fun to see how so much of the work that we've heard over the last few weeks is starting to raise new questions. Okay, so let's start at the Juno Beach Center. One of our partners in our discussions, Maria Vinecore and Alex Fitzgerald Black, have worked for the JBC and have done a wonderful job in trying to convey something about the Canadian presence, not just on the beaches of Juno, as Terry talked about, but also further to the south. It is a site of memory, a lieu de mémoire, to use the phrase that we so often discuss in these matters. It was the vision of a Canadian, a young Canadian, who came ashore on D-Day, Garth Webb, and it was then very much the product in the 1990s and early 2000s of the veterans moment. And it is, in fact, as we can see here, so much of the design and so much of the support of it is visible at the beginning with these plinths that recognize so many veterans of the Normandy campaign, many of them, I'm sure, who have died since those names were first affixed. It has become a site of memory for certainly the day on the 6th of June, as we've mentioned in previous introductions. And we can see too how different formations, an anti-aircraft battery and looks like a 25-pounder gun, are sitting on the beaches where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles stormed ashore on the 6th of June, 1944. And as I say, the work of Marie-Eve and Alex and the director, Natalie Worthington, is a great testament to the energy and to the close relationships that they have with the French communities, especially. Our next stop is a place that we will visit as members of the CBF in a series of commemorative activities that we lead on the 7th of June, on the day after the D-Day commemorations. And this is one of the first monuments, as we've mentioned, created by the original generation of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, or the Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation. This is on the grounds of Le Memorial, and it raises a point then that certainly comes up heavily in the censorship reports. The design, as Terry mentioned at our first meeting in May, was the product of the work of 12 design students from both Quebec and Ottawa, who came and who surveyed the land and who tried to come up with a reflective concept that would recognize in an artistic way the Canadian role in the Battle of Normandy. And I think it's really effective. You can see here, this is probably a smaller gathering on the grounds of the Le Memorial in Caen. And it shows, of course, a reflective pool. In it are the words of Virgil, which I should know off by heart, but I don't have the words in front of me. Where are they? No day will erase you from the memory of time. And behind the porte de drapeau, the flag bearers, is a small short wall which contains, on which is etched, the names of 122 communes in Normandy that were liberated by the Canadians through June, July, and August of 1944. And it does then speak to an issue that continues to this day, that relationship between Canadians and French civilians. It's part of a growing body of material. It's the subject of an important new museum in Falaise, which the Canadians would take in August of 1944. And it does very much show up in the censorship reports. Early on, as the invasion is developing in June and into July, it's clear that the Canadians writing home are slightly wary of French civilians. And the reverse is also true. There are concerns that indeed there are rumors that there are French snipers and that the French civilians in certain areas are not welcoming the liberators in much the way that they would have been expected. There's a certain chauvinism, there's certainly a certain sexism to some of the letters, but it's clear that the civilian population, in spite of the fact that so many of them had suffered terribly both before and during the invasion, especially with the weight of Allied air power that was brought to bear through so much of France in the days, weeks, and months before the invasion, that the French are becoming extremely friendly and welcoming to the Canadians and to all the Allies. And so we see, this is the censorship report I'm going to refer to repeatedly, towards the end of August 1944, the French civilians are good and they're kind to us all. They wave as they trudge along and they shout, "Vive la France." These people have endured much. This is a private from the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. And they almost more than mind and body can stand. So it was no small wonder we were looked on with amazement and distrust at the very start of things. He acknowledges that initial wariness, but that's all over with now, and we're royally received. Remarkable. Lee talked back in his presentation about the reception that he still receives from the people of Roquencourt, which was, as he admitted, largely destroyed in the attack south that we'll talk about in a few minutes in August of 1944. But there was a recognition over time, as he suggests, that those villages were sacrificed in order to save France. Certainly that was one of the ways to justify especially the attack on Caen in July, where much of the city was destroyed. So we can get a sense then of the relationship, sometimes early on, perhaps delicate and cautious. But as we've already suggested, the French civilians are more than happy once the results are clear that the bridgehead is going to withstand, that the French are going to welcome the Canadians. Indeed, it also speaks, and this is to a point that Carla Demour raised, the relationship then between the Canadians, English Canadians and French Canadians was perhaps quite different. Early on, it was the French Canadian units who were really suffering in the context of being in England for so long, because as some of the censorship reports will suggest, the unilingual Francophones were homesick. Completely acceptable among young late teens and early 20s, kids far away from home in those regiments. But once they come to Normandy, here they are speaking in a similar kind of Norman dialect, and quite quickly do those relations in this respect become the basis of marriage, that in the Maple Leaf, which itself is being produced out of an aging printing press in Caen just after it's liberated in July, is talking about how a young French Canadian, Léon Gagné from the Regiment de la Chaudière, is going to marry a young Norman woman, Jacqueline Catherine, who it does speak, I think, to the kind of relationship perhaps that was almost unique among French-speaking soldiers in Normandy. I should say too, that the relationships become complex. And this is a book that I think it would be well worth looking at. David Boris has just published this. It's a reference to the complex role that civil affairs officers had to play in Normandy and onwards through Northwest Europe in trying to help rebuild both the physical infrastructure of cities that have been destroyed, as well as the kind of governmental arrangements that had to be restored, often in complex ways, as so many different competing political forces were at play here, both in France, Belgium, and into the Netherlands as well. It's a neat new book. I would highly recommend it. It speaks again to these growing issues about the civilians at the sharp end. And it also, I should say, as we move into Falaise, we won't have a chance to go there on our virtual tour, but a great new museum developed out of Le Mémorial, where the Canadian Garden is located, speaks very much to the experience of French civilians. It's a great museum, and it does speak to the horrendous losses and the difficult readjustments that liberation brought for so many French citizens. Well worth looking at. Okay, our next stop, the Abbé Ardin. Mark Milner introduced us to the Bridgehead battles immediately after the invasion, in which 7 and 9 Brigade, he spoke especially about 7 Brigade, as they tried to punch their way towards the rail line that connected Caen and Bayeux. And again, his work was very much a kind of revision of the Stacy overview, which in large measure argued that those, particularly the 9 Brigade attack, which almost came within view of this building on the left, was a failure. The Canadians were thrown back in the face of tough German resistance and in the face of Canadian inexperience. Sorry, I'm gonna get there. So let's talk about the Abbé Ardin, another site of memory. And we did talk briefly in the afterword about how it was because of the fighting abilities of the Canadians that the Germans, particularly the 12th SS Panzer Division, which we faced so much during the Normandy campaign, were not used to simply seeing such resistance and seeing such, well, dare one say, abilities among their opponents. So the Abbé Ardin, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to kind of see my gears. I'm stalling the van right now. Oh, well, I'll just move forward. Oh, heaven's sake. No, I don't want to do that. There, I'll move up to the implications here, because it's clear that in the aftermath of these early Bridgehead battles, the Germans committed a series of atrocities, some of which, not all of which, were committed in this garden behind this fence at the Abbé Ardin. Golly, sorry. And you can see, if I move it one more spot, no, of course I moved it too far. You can tell my driving is not the best. You can see behind those fences, we have, as the CBF in recent years, have installed 3 plaques, which describe what happened in that garden behind that fence in the opening stages of the Normandy campaign. And those plaques, in English and in French, list the names of the young lads who were taken, held, interrogated, in some cases beaten, and in some cases shot. And the explanatory plaque in both languages speaks to the horrendous kinds of atrocities that happened not only at the Abbé Ardin, but in other villages nearby, at Le Menu Patrie, at Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, at Moulins, and especially at the Château d'Audrieux, where another 12th SS battalion commander committed a series of murders, especially of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Ultimately, something in the order of 159 Canadians were killed after their surrender. And it does speak to the ferocity of the battle. It does speak especially to perhaps a special view of the enemy that the Canadians had as a result of these activities. David French, great British historian, has written extensively about how British soldiers may have lost their lives after surrender to to German atrocities, but in large measure, his argument was that the British couldn't overcome their training and their backgrounds and were generally not very hostile towards the Germans as the Normandy battles developed. I would argue then that perhaps the experience of the Canadians, because of these atrocities, because of the rumors that would have spread very quickly, General Crerar addresses them in early August and says and insists that there be no retaliatory measures, but it does very much reflect upon the nature of the battlefield. And I think then that what's also there is a certain curious confidence that comes up through successive censorship reports, again, however selective these might be. We have to treat these things with a certain degree of questioning, as we do all evidence. But there's also a curious confidence among the Canadians that despite the horrendous activity of the SS and the Hitler Youth, that the Canadians are better than they are. And that's certainly clear in the battles of July and into August. So much so, and again, this is the censorship report at the end of the campaign. It's obviously, again, reflecting the buoyancy of the victory, is that the SS and Hitler Youth troops were said to be tough, stubborn fighters. It was felt that they would surrender more readily were it not for their officers or the fear of being shot when taken prisoner. There's a lot of things that might well come out of that statement, but it does at least reflect this sense that there's a curious respect. There's almost a curious feeling that they're of sympathy towards the young SS troops that they had first met and would continue to fight and largely destroy 12th SS Panzer Division as the Normandy campaign developed. It's also worth mentioning, again, I had a quick read of the Canadian Provo Corps, or the field companies in charge of traffic direction, in charge of a variety of activities, especially as the breakout begins in August. They process over 25,000 German prisoners through August alone in 1944. So they are, as Lee had mentioned, the 1st Canadian Army is a killing machine, and they are taking enormous numbers of casualties. They are inflicting enormous numbers of casualties, but they're also taking a great many prisoners as well. Okay, so let's drop south of Caen now. We've gone around the peripheric and we've gone to point 67, and I won't dwell much on point 67 because Lee did such a lovely job in talking about what it shows, what it represents, what it means. And as an educator of educators, I think Lee and Cindy and Blake Seward and Ben Seward, I saw him the other night, have used this particular space. Again, the product of the initiative of the CBF, along with Terry and David Patterson, and also now with a great deal of support from the local community, to create a belvedere that is an important element of understanding the Canadian experience in the Normandy campaign. Now, as Lee said, and I won't go over his stuff in any great detail, the beauty of point 67, which was once, as Lee said, a garbage dump, is that it shows so much. To the north or to the right is Caen. To the west, where we're looking down that alleyway, is across the Orne River, where the British operations were trying to sweep into Caen, Operation Jupiter in June and July. To the south then are the operations that we'll remember in late July. Operations, well, Atlantic as well, in support of the armored attack south of Caen, and then Operation Spring, which would be such a costly operation for the Canadians at that time. Let me see if there, it's again, Lee had far better graphics here. My driving is not all that good, but you can outsee to the east, Verrières Ridge, out to Verrières Village, where the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry would fight with such success, where the Régiment de Maisonneuve would attack, and further on, well beyond the line of hydro lines, is the village of Tilly-la-Campagne, which would be attacked by, oh golly, no less than 4 or 5 infantry battalions, including the first introduction of the 4th Division into the theater in late July, early August of 1944. There's so much, there's so many activities, and there's so many young Canadians killed in and around Point 67 that it is an important point of memory that Lee and his team have used to such great effect. The point, I suppose, that I'm interested in, and again, maybe he did mention it, but I think it should be emphasized, is that it's through the battles that are taking place around Point 67 on the 23rd of July of 1944 that we see the creation of, or the introduction of 1st Canadian Army Headquarters into the theater. Now, it's written up, the official historians talk about it. 23 July 1944 should be, I think, a remarkably important day in the life of the Canadian Army. I hope mess dinners are being served on that night in or around. It's the only time in which a Canadian Army headquarters will operate in a theater of war, and I hope it will be the last. It does seem to me that it's an important date that the soldiers understood as important, and that in light of our emphasis on operations and so on, has largely been overlooked. In fact, it's also true that in some ways it gets lost in the discussion of the criticisms that are raised against the performance of 1st Canadian Army. It's created in England in April of 42, as I've mentioned. And as Mark Milner mentioned in his presentation, one of its first tasks is to start the planning for the cross-channel invasion. And as Mark showed me and represented in some of his presentation, the role of the Canadians is supposed to be, it seems, far bigger in the Normandy campaign, in the initial and indeed even in the late planning stages. It's clear too that Montgomery, who's in charge of 21 Army Group and all the Allied forces in the theater, delays the imposition or delays the introduction of Army headquarters under Harry Crerar for as long as he can. And again, I think that's an important factor that we have to understand. And Stacy argues quite from the get-go that when 1st Canadian Army Headquarters comes into the field, under it is both the 2nd Canadian Corps under Guy Simonds, but also the 1st British Corps under a guy named John Crocker. And it's clear that Crocker and Crerar, right from the get-go, are not seeing eye to eye. And Crerar, perhaps a bit too officious, a bit too pressing, is going to have difficulties with John Crocker. It's nothing compared to the problems that he's going to have with Bernard Law Montgomery. So it does seem to me as if we're thinking about a space up here for all the battles, we should at least also recognize that 1st Canadian Army Headquarters is being developed here. It is a multinational force, both with British and Polish forces. Eventually, it would also include Dutch and Belgian forces, as well as American forces, but that's for another time and another discussion. So it is a multinational coalition, which we should know far more about, and we should recognize it, because in many ways, of course, the Canadians who are searching for that narrative, who are searching for a separate Canadian identity, are pretty happy to see 1st Canadian Army Headquarters coming into the theater. Indeed, the censorship reports from late August, again in the heady days, seems to affect their relationships with British and American troops. The people back home should be proud, according to a private from the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, from Waterloo County, Ontario. They should be proud to have a Canadian army so good, but a little small to compare with the others. If it wasn't for the Canadians and the Yanks, I don't know where the English people would be, as the Germans prefer fighting against 10 Limeys and 1 Canadian. Oh boy, a certain bias there. And then, of course, another signalman for the 2nd Canadian Corps signals the American and British have the Jerrys on the run, but of course they have in the opposition we have. That's a pretty insightful statement. The Canadian infantry don't need to take a backseat to any of them over here. Brilliant statement, quite insightful. Certainly shows a certain bias there in the case of our private from the HLI against the English, but it's true. The Canadians had been trained and took a great deal of good training from the British. They had been under the influence of Montgomery for so long And it's fascinating to see there's a certain ambivalence about being with the English. Hard to know what that all means, but the creation of 1st Canadian Army, it seems to me, is a much overlooked date and an important element of creating a Canadian narrative for the Second World War. And then, of course, there up in the upper left corner is Saint Andre, one of the objectives out of Point 67 in late July. But you can see, as Lee had mentioned, that this then becomes, in a way, the start line across Verrières Ridge towards Operation Totalize, one of the first big operations by 1st Canadian Army. And as Lee has rightly argued, it is subject to all kinds of debate, all kinds of controversy about what it meant. One might well argue that it depends on how you view 1st Canadian Army. If you've decided that 1st Canadian Army is a ragtag operation of inexperienced troops and inexperienced generals, then you're going to view Operation Totalize in a certain way. If you've made that decision, then perhaps we're being colored by a set of presumptions that I'm not willing to accept. It's true that Operation Totalize has its failings, and yet it's a daring, remarkable way of punching through the German defenses south of Caen. It involves an imaginative use of armor vehicles. It involves close coordination, not always good, with air power, night operations in order to try to destroy the German defenses south of Caen, south of Verrières Ridge, so that the armor, particularly 1 Polish and 4th Canadian Armor, can start pushing south of Saint-Do. Well, we know that the Operation Totalize begins really well. The short bombings, though, delay and reflect certainly the problems of coordinating between ground and air forces. But look at the distance covered. I mean, when we're on the battlefield tour, we start driving off of Verrières Ridge and we make our way to, let's say, Grenville and Gannery, where my uncle was first in battle as part of 4th Canadian Armored Division, as part of the Lincoln Welland Regiment. And you think, wow, in terms of distance, in terms of ground covered, in terms of the German defenses that have been destroyed, it's a remarkable achievement. Was it supposed to have reached Falaise? There's a great deal of suggestion that it wasn't, but that the fluid strategic situation had somehow made Operation Totalize more than it was intended to be. It's clear too that one of the problems is that it's going to be compared simply by date with Amiens, the Battle of Amiens from 8 August 1918, I should say. And the Amiens comparison is one that seems to have further kind of detracted from the achievements of Operation Totalize from 7 to 10 August of 1944. We also know that the Corps commander, Guy Simonds, who had come up with the scheme, is not very sympathetic with the armored divisions, especially, who seemed to fail to push forward. Simonds was not one to mollycoddle his troops. He never really gained their loyalty that way, but he was under enormous pressure given the situation that was starting to evolve to the south that was forcing Totalize to become more than it actually was. When we go and visit, we often go to a small place you can see in the wheat fields east of Estrée-la-Campagne. And this is a monument at Point 140 where the Algonquin and British Columbia Regiment tanks met a horrendous fate as they simply lost their bearings. And the battle group, which had been created, Worthington Force, named for the BCR commander, was lost its way, moved far further east, called for aerial support and artillery support in the belief that they were on their objectives, which were in fact 3, 4, 5 kilometers off to the west. The Totalize does, if you decide to stop at that place, it does appear as if Totalize seems to be a failure. If you actually go to where the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders reached Hill 195 off to the east, one can see there's no marker there, but it does in fact reflect how Totalize was a remarkable piece of operational work that for a young Canadian army was a pretty amazing achievement. 51st Highland Division is also involved in that operation along with the Poles. It's a multinational force. They do a remarkable job. After the yelling of Guy Simmons, the Canadians launch a daylight attack, a kind of continuation beginning on the 14th of August at the Liaison, or it's called Operation Tractable. And this signpost sits in the small village of Rouve, which is not far from point 140. In fact, the start line for Tractable is not far from where the old operation had ended, where Tractable had ended at point 140. And again, the same problem, difficulties finding direction, this time in the dust and the sun. And also it was clear that if this is the point in which British historians are saying there's something wrong with 1st Canadian Army, 1st Canadian Army has been operational for 3 weeks. It's clear that Tractable is in fact going to run into difficulties. But that photograph in the center, which shows the tanks of, I believe, the Fort Garry Horse, this was dedicated by Eddie Goodman, who supplied the money for this particular plaque, suggests that it was the Liaison River that was one of the great problems for the Canadians as they began to push south. There was simply no place to cross. The Germans had blown the bridges, and there was no real place where the armor could find a crossing in the steep banks. Nevertheless, the Canadians push on against heavy resistance. And by this time, the Battle of Normandy is taking a dramatic series of turns. You'll recall that just at the beginning of the Totalize battles, the Germans decided to, after Hitler had not been assassinated, Hitler is determined to try to cut off the advance of the Americans who have pushed south in late July, Operation Cobra. And he decides in a fateful decision that the German generals will then excuse themselves of any responsibility for, of trying to cut across the battlefield in the hopes of stopping the Americans. And of course, that effort fails. And that great strategic miscue is the basis of a massive Allied victory in Normandy. The Canadians then are being given still more pressure to push south, which they do, as this slide will show. I should say there, Arthur Gullickson's great book about the kind of reinforcement issue of the Canadians is well worth looking at, published by UBC Press. And it speaks to the ability, particularly of armored formations, to rebuild after the kinds of losses that they're going to face, particularly things like the BCR at point 140. It is a neat book of logistics and supply, which again suggests something about the elements, the rear elements of the army that we haven't really looked at yet. I'll come back to that one. The closing of the Falaise Gap then, just to the north of our map, is where Tractable has developed, and we've driven through this many times. The 16th, the dates are really important here. The 16th of August is the date that Hitler's plans have failed, and he manages, or reluctantly permits, the withdrawal of 2 German armies across the front. So it takes him 10 days to make the decision to push the 2 5th Panzer and 7th armies out of the Normandy theater. In that time then, because of the kind of strategic balloon that's starting to form, the pressure on the Canadians is enormous. And they're coming across difficult ground and trying then to, in effect, stop the strong north shoulder of the German exit from Normandy. On the 16th of Falaise, the same day the order is made to withdraw, the Canadian 2nd Division reaches Falaise. And then the 4th Division, which you remember has just been in the theater since the beginning of the month, is supposed to be heading towards Falaise. But again, a whole series of strategic decisions are being made that make it clear that Falaise is not really the target at all, is not the objective. And the 4th Division under George Kitching, who, as we know, will be relieved of his commands, have to sit and turn their massive number of vehicles and begin to move east through those difficult wooded hilly areas down towards the town or the village of Trun. It is, for anyone who's driven through there, and I'm not trying to make light of the navigational issues, it's a tough go. So the problem of moving an armored division from one axis to another was a difficult one. Not to mention the fact that the 1st Polish Armored Division moves all the way across the front and tries to reach up into the heights there to the upper right of in our map, to reach into what becomes the main German exit out of Normandy. You can see the Dives River flowing through the bottom of that valley. This then becomes the main exit for the Germans. To the south, British or American 90th Division have swung through. The British forces west of Falaise are also pushing down, but the main exit, the cork in the bottle, it seems, is to be filled by both the Canadians and the Poles. It's a dramatic finish, which of course has led to all kinds of criticisms and all kinds of complex discussions that we may want to talk about a little bit more. There is the road that out of Trun, this small group, a troop of tanks from the South Alberta 29th Armored Reconnaissance Regiment, led by a 30-something major named David Curry, along with 100 or so troops from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, will make their way down the D13 towards what becomes the last crossing of the Dives River in the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. And that fatal final 3 days will, of course, see the final climax of the Battle of Normandy, in which then David Curry would win the Victoria Cross. Now that road, let's see how my road goes. Okay, to the right then, one more monument, one more commemorative space that Terry and David and the mayor of Saint-Lambert negotiated, along with the support of John Cleghorn, a former chancellor of Wilfrid Laurier University, and his family donated the space and created this belvedere, which would interpret a Canadian end to the Battle of Normandy. And it still is a popular spot for us to go and for visitors to understand something about those final climactic days. Let's see, I'm gonna try desperately to drive down there. No, it's not gonna work for me, I'm sorry. I will do my best to get back. So you can see then that above these heights to the left is where in the heights to the left are the Poles trying to fight off a series of counterattacks through that fateful set of days, while the Germans, the remnants of 2 armies, are trying to make their way crawling through the muck, trying to get past the small Canadian force, which will be reinforced, I should add. There's always talk that the Canadian forces sent to Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives were without any officers other than Curry. Well, in fact, as we know, they're reinforced by a company from the Lincoln and Welland Regiment led by John Arkell Dunlop, who will play a much important but often unsung role in that final few days in what's known as the final battles of the Normandy campaign. Down that hill and across, oh, look at that, I'm making it. Down the D13 is the village itself. Let's see if I'm gonna, oh, I'm managing now. You can see the enormous cost that the European community brought to ensure there were proper parking spaces and all these kinds of things. And this then is, well, we'll show this, sure. Famous photograph, but you can also see the action that's actually made on the 19th of August when the Canadians are in Saint-Lambert. No less than a journalist, a photographer, a still photographer, and a video photographer are in the area. Donald Graves' fine book on the South Alberta Regiment highlighted the fact that as much as we thought that this material, this film material, was lost in the archives, it in fact is saved on YouTube. So there you are. An action then that's depicted It's a German lieutenant, map case in hand, who thinks he's going to escape, quickly captured. Thousands of German troops making their way out of the final pocket. It's a great bit of film, quite remarkable, really, that it's there at all. And this then is the photograph captured by this film photographer of the capture of this lieutenant as they're making their way out. A more detailed picture shows hundreds of troops being marched into prisoner of war camps by the provosts in the final days of the Battle of Normandy. So, and there's of course David Curry. This is a photograph reproduced in Stacy's Official History with the wonderful caption. I'm paraphrasing. This is as close as we'll ever get to seeing someone win the Victoria Cross. And David Curry, of course, was not granted the Victoria Cross until November of 1944. Remarkable fellow in many ways. The David Curry Armory in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, reflects his Saskatchewan origins. But as Dave Alexander will tell me, of course, he is buried. He lived for many years in Owen Sound, Ontario, and is buried there, along with two other VC winners, remarkably. See, Dave, I didn't forget about you. So the commemorative aspects here are really important that Terry and David and John Cleghorn wanted to emphasize the climax and the role that the Canadians played, far and away greater than their numbers would otherwise suggest. The creation of a first Canadian Army was given a series of quite remarkable roles by strategic default, one might argue, and they suffered from it. The highest casualties of any Allied formations in the Normandy campaign were 2 and 3 Canadian infantry divisions. Now, what that signifies, as Terry would argue, is that it reflects the amount of fighting, the amount of tense days in battle that they saw through the course of the campaign, both above Caen and further south, especially in late July and August of 1944. It is then an important site for Canadians to understand. It's an important site to understand the losses, but it's important also to try to ask new questions of this material. I should also, as I say, refer to some of these books that are emerging. Angelo Caravaggio is an astute commentator, and is especially well suited to talk about the 4th Armored Division in those 21 days, in which it plays a crucial role in the Normandy campaign, and makes a very good effort at understanding those losses particularly of its senior commanders. I should say too, where are we here? Andrew Brown's book, also in talking about morale, is also a function very much of leadership. His new book, coming out in December, on Canadian non-coms in the Second World War, is also a new bit of insight into how that important element of leadership, that backbone, is created in the Canadian forces during the Second World War. Okay, so almost there. How am I doing? Oh my goodness. I thought you were going to send me some warnings. All of which is to say, I'm going to make my way down here, is that in the aftermath of the Normandy campaign, this enormous sense of morale was huge. And here again, I'm citing from the censorship report from 16 to 31 August. Morale's magnificent. A splendid fighting spirit was shown. Troops are confident of their abilities to win speedy victory and are determined to do so. Many felt that the Canadians had been given tough jobs and were proud of the way they carried them out. Hardly a mention of weariness. If that's not a definition of high morale, I don't know what is. Also, the censors were emphatic that great satisfaction expressed at the formation of a separate Canadian Army. These guys were Canadians. They had Canada on their shoulder patches, and they wanted to be defined as Canadians, even within, especially within, these massive British and American formations. So, all of which is to say, why doesn't that get reflected in the official Army history? Well, a lot of different reasons, but I will say that the inclusion of a TIFF that that Colonel Stacy includes gives us a hint at some of the ways in which the verdict of the Canadians doesn't come out all that favorably. 21 August 1944, here's the the senior command of the Allied forces. There's Courtney Hodges on the left. He's just taken over command of 1st U.S. Army from Omar Bradley, who's second from the right. Omar Bradley is about to become the head of 12 Army Group, and he will be then in the equivalent position to Montgomery in the center. So, which is why their smiles are rather strained. Monty is about to both get a promotion and a demotion at the same time. On the 1st of September, Monty will become a field marshal, but he will also be merely an Army Group commander. The Americans will not be under his command. As a result, he will have two armies under him. One, Miles Dempsey's 2nd British Army, under which the Canadians fight until the 23rd of July. And there's Harry Crerar, second from the left, cigarette in hand, looking rather stiff as he stands beside Monty. Harry Crerar was not a charismatic leader, but he reflected, as Paul Dixon has said in his fine biography, he was a thoroughly Canadian general. And so there's a curious episode that gets included in the Stacy official history that I'll be very brief and talk about before we stop for questions. The episode has to do with Crerar's visit to Dieppe. And if ever, I think, a new narrative was starting to unfold, it was the fact that the 2nd Division, which had landed on Dieppe in August of 1942, was there to take the salute of Harry Crerar in September of 1944. Miraculously, the town was not defended. An air attack was called off with 20 minutes to spare, and the port was liberated by many of the same troops, by the same units that had attacked there 2 years before. It was ultimately a great moment for Canada. It was then a kind of, the censors realized that they, unlike every other period, the Canadians were breaking censorship rules all the time because they kept saying, we're in Dieppe, look at what we've done. But it did lead to a spat, a tiff between Monty and Crerar, because Montgomery felt that Crerar shouldn't have been in Dieppe, he should have been at a crucial planning meeting. Words were exchanged, and at one point, Montgomery says, finally, I should get rid of you. I'm being very quick and my paraphrasing is I hope accurate, and it is. To which Harry Crerar says, well, we'll bring these matters up to higher command. He realized that he could then go to the Canadian government, of which his loyalties lay, along with those of Montgomery. And Montgomery then realized that Crerar was determined to make this an issue about operational control, and he backed down. After Crerar, in a very tightly worded memorandum, which he presented and which eventually, portions of which found its way into the official history, Crerar said there were 800 reasons why I should be at that Dieppe ceremony, and those are the guys that had died at Dieppe. So there was then a very strong disagreement, which eventually it seemed to boil over. The Canadian liaison to Montgomery said he should apologize, which Monty did, and said the matter was closed. And yet it wasn't. The tensions between those two leaders had been apparent since the beginning, since at least 1942. Certainly Crerar was seen as not experienced. Monty much preferred Guy Simonds, the corps commander, to take over 1st Canadian Army, which he would eventually do when Crerar was sick with dysentery. But it's also clear that Monty would also make one of those crucial statements that historians have followed for many years, and that I think has a great deal to do with how we've characterized the Canadian performance. In his logs, he would complain to his immediate commander, Alan Brooke, about the Canadians. He would complain too that the Canadians were too slow, especially in their operations to try to keep up with 2nd British Army under Dempsey as they made their way across northern France towards Belgium and towards Antwerp. And it does seem to me as if it's that kind of vague, but in a way devastating assessment, which has followed the Canadians. for many years, despite the remarkable sense that they had accomplished as a Canadian force, that they had accomplished a great deal, that they had had some tough jobs through the Normandy campaign, and that they had suffered some terrible casualties, that the Canadians would gain that kind of, I don't know, dismissive assessment by a British general. I think that's stuck. And I think that's certainly something that we're trying to address in our discussions. But it's also clear that the kinds of questions that morale brings up raises all kinds of interesting elements of other things that we should discuss. Okay, one more slide and then I'll let you go. I said we'd stop at a Canadian cemetery, and so we have. We're back at Benny, up near the beaches, and I was particularly moved by the wonderful words that Eric McGeer, a great friend of the center, has written about Benny-sur-Mer in an article at Canadian Military History about the inscriptions on the headstones. And I thought, you know, in many ways, the cemeteries at both Benny and at Bretteville that contain over 5,000 Canadian war dead reflect in some ways the perilous position in the ways in which we understand the Canadians. These are in many ways First World War cemeteries, the cross of sacrifice and the stone of remembrance with the words that Kipling had represented the ideas of remembrance are very much driven out of the First World War. The size of the markers are also very much, again, a product of English architects who wanted to portray or create the idea of an English country garden. So this is, to me, in the shadow of both British and also First World War memory. But as you can see in this picture, there are the Canadian maple leaves at the top of each of those markers. And it does strike me that this is an appropriate way as a body of men who fought their way through the Normandy campaign, who landed under the command of the British Second Army, who emerge as part of a First Canadian Army, who suffered so much at the hands of the German forces, who learned so much from the French civilians, who create in some ways a Canadian Army culture that sustains their morale, is an important way in which we might remember the Canadians in Normandy. And as so often the words that we've used on the various plaques that the CBF have created, they fought for the liberation of Europe and the hope of a better world. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Geoff. That was quite a whirlwind tour you took us on tonight. And a very good one, and I think an excellent way of wrapping up the series. But I don't want to conclude too quickly because, you know, we've got questions. They've been coming in throughout the entire talk. A ton of them already filtering in. And I want to get to those questions shortly, but I just want to remind folks just very briefly that if they, you know, enjoyed Geoff's talk, he spoke, kind of referenced it very briefly, his book, Career as Lieutenants. We do have that available tonight for purchase at 20% off. I've included all of the information in the chat function at the bottom of your screen there. So you can click on the link, and I've included the discount code to enter. And if you haven't seen it, or maybe came late and I had already entered that information, just shoot me a quick note and I'll make sure to send that off to you. But let's get to these questions. We got about 20 minutes to go through these questions. I apologize in advance. We probably won't be able to get to all of the questions, but we will do our very best to get through as many as we possibly can. So Geoff, why don't we start? I kind of want to start off with the historiography and Stacy's role in that historiographical debate about the performance of First Canadian Army, because there are a number of questions around that. And the first one that came up actually right at the beginning was from Howard Hisdall from Kelowna, BC, and he wonders if Stacy's victory campaign might have looked a bit different if he were perhaps a member of a different officer's mess. He was an officer's A mess. Perhaps if he had been in B mess, would that narrative have looked any different?
Well, I must admit, I don't fully, I think I get the nature of that question, but I won't, I think Stacy was under an enormous amount of pressure during the course of the Normandy campaign. He's not the official historian at all. He's in a way a kind of, he's organizing the historical sections, but he has not, if memory serves, and Roger Sardi will tell me if I'm wrong, but he's not yet the Army official historian. And it does seem to me that as with the case in so many things, the post-war atmosphere is really important to understand the kinds of things that Stacy can and cannot do. And Roger's work, and I should also say Megan Hamilton's work, was a student of Roger's. I hope she's going to be a student of mine pretty soon. Megan's terrific. And they're talking about the dynamics of creating the official histories after the war. And you know, they're having to deal with a whole set of things. The budgets from D&D are being cut dramatically in the post-war. Brooke Claxton doesn't want official histories. In fact, as we know, the Air Force and the naval histories aren't created until 50 years after the fact. The Army history then is very closely constricted. And I do think that the hand of Charles Folks, who's the CDS, is the chief of the general staff, excuse me, has a hand in how in what the official history can and cannot do, and what it can and cannot say. So so that's at least a partial answer. There's also, you know, the constraints, as Roger has said and Megan has said too, of trying to get access to documents because it's a coalition force. And it's clear that the British are quite reluctant in some ways to give access to the Canadians. A conference in the late 40s, 1948 in Washington, tries to put the American, British, and Canadian and other Dominion forces on historians on an equal footing. But the British are pretty reluctant to give up the full access to some of the higher decisions that were made at the cabinet level, which is a real source of frustration for Stacy. Other elements there that are worth talking about, but it's clear that Stacy had to deal with a very difficult environment in order to produce the history that he did.
Keeping and going with questions of historiography, Geoff, a question from Dave Alexander, you mentioned earlier from Owen Sound. And this kind of gets into the bread and butter of what we do as historians. So I think it's perhaps a great question to ask so people understand exactly what we do. He asks, what kind of lessons can be drawn from tracing and evolving historiography as you've done from, you know, Stacy over to someone like Terry, and then back again with Fennell with a similar kind of Stacy narrative. What sort of lessons can be derived from doing so? And why should we constantly be examining and re-examining primary sources in light of these kind of historiographical debates and controversies?
Well, you know, I keep coming back to the work of R.G. Collingwood, who was a famous philosopher of history, writing in the 1940s. And I'm trying to remember if it was Terry or others that made me read R.G. Collingwood. And R.G. Collingwood compared history to a river, that it kept flowing, it constantly changes. Anyone who thinks that it doesn't understand about historiographical debate. Right now, we can see how we should also remember, as Collingwood says, that official histories are just other sources. And I think for a lot of time, though, official histories have always been seen as the kind of, you know, official tome, and that there was little debate about that. I faced that many years ago when I first started going to Ottawa to look at the documents. The other thing which is really so wonderful is that we need to keep asking more questions, because sometimes the questions perpetuate the same answers. And I think that's really problematic. If we've all decided that 1st Canadian Army is not really very good, then our questions and our research is going to be colored by that. I'm really excited too when I look at somebody like Matthew Barrett's work. Matthew Barrett put me on to the courts-martial documents, which he, of course, has used to such great benefit. His book's coming out pretty soon about courts-martials for officers. But the courts-martial files are absolutely fascinating, and they raise all kinds of questions that we have never really asked before. You know, Lee mentioned a few weeks ago, you know, we got to keep asking new questions. Are we still wanting to talk about operational effectiveness? Are we still talking about the speed at which the Canadians performed? And in some ways, I'm still hung up on that. But as I look at the morale stuff, again, thanks to Jonathan and you know, Will Pratt and John Maker and others have used it. Carolyn Demours has used it as well. You begin to really get a sense that you're able, however limited those documents are, that you're able to get a sense of what people are actually thinking at the time and actually writing about. Now, it's not necessarily representative, and we know that the censors have their own biases, but it does at least give us a sense of some of the ways in which we could understand the war from the ground up rather than from the top down. And so often, you know, we've been concerned about operational effectiveness and conscription. And so for many years, here's a quick example, then I'll let it go. In 1956, ELM Tommy Burns writes Manpower in the Canadian Army. And it was long considered this critique against the Canadians and against the structure of the Canadians and all that sort of thing. And that we were had too much administrative tail and all that. Turns out, you know, I think I discovered this, his numbers are kind of wrong, especially in comparing the Canadians to the Americans. The administrative tail is not all that much bigger than it is in the United States forces. So that seems to me that you know, we've got to be careful about how we deal with somebody like Burns and Manpower in the Canadian Army. But it also means that we have to turn, if we ask about morale, then we really do have to look at the rear administrative tail and ask some questions about what they're doing and what effect they're having upon morale and ultimately upon the fate of the Canadians. And there's so many fun questions that we can ask about that, whether it has to do with discipline in the courts-martial records, whether it has to do with mail, you know, whether it has to do with entertainment. It's a really rich body of stuff that we continue to ask, that we continue to look at, but only if we ask the right questions. Thank you, Dave.
Building from that, the morale reports, Geoff, there are a couple of questions about morale. One coming from Rob, and I apologize if I butcher this last name, Rob DeBroyle from Winnipeg. He's wondering on the other side of the coin of kind of the negative effects or the kind of negative parts of battle that would have affected morale. He's asking if the lack of relief throughout the battle of Normandy had any role to play in the effects of morale.
If I understand that question, it's a good question. So let me answer it in the way that I think I understand it. One of the things that Fennell argues is that for 2nd British Army, and I think it's the same for the 1st Canadians, is that, you know, 3 Division is in battle for about a month and a half, 56 days, I think. One Regina rifle guy keeps careful track of how long he's been in battle. He's exhausted, and 3rd Division is in a pretty rough way. And so they are finally, after the liberation of Caen, pushed back into the rear areas and given a rest. Now, all of which is to say that we can't necessarily say a rest is a good thing, because so many of the guys are writing saying, oh my God, you know, what do we end up with in a rest area except more spit and polish, more inspections, you know, more discipline, and that drives them crazy. But that might be just me as a civilian kind of seeing their complaints. But it's true that if you think about the rear areas, which we often don't think about, the Canadians had at least 3 field hospitals. in Bayeux. 3 of 10, I think, were Canadian. Robert Engen, I hope, is going to be doing some neat stuff soon on medicine in the Canadian Army. There's entertainment, there's showers, there's, there's a whole way in which then you're trying to kind of deal with both those immediate demands of fatigue, as well as trying to cheer them up, put their minds onto other things, put them into an army show where they can laugh at Wayne and Schuster, watch a couple of movies. They hated movies that had to do with adventure. They wanted to watch Hope and Crosby. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road pictures were great diversions. They howled over Abbott and Costello, all of which only shows my age and maybe the age of some people listening. So you've got, a way to get them out of the theater, get them out of the action, away from the guns, deal with the guys that are getting windy. And Terry and Bill McAndrew have talked about the ways in which they're assessing psychiatric stress and battle exhaustion in a pretty humane way, putting them to sleep for several days, sometimes with sodium pentothal, and then providing encouragement from divisional psychiatrists was a good way of getting them back into the action. So rest is a big thing. The other point that becomes a real source of contention is leave, particularly leave back to Canada. And I don't have a full handle on this yet, but leave back to Canada is really fascinating because in the end, the Canadian leave policy is probably the worst of all the Allied armies. Because of the manpower situation, they don't want to be sending troops back because in part, as Jonathan Fennell argues, the Kiwi example, the New Zealand example is disastrous. They send guys back in 43 who don't want to come back to the theater. And that becomes a heavy political issue in New Zealand as they arrive in Wellington and find all kinds of people who are doing very well by the war, far and away from the Mediterranean. So leave is a really interesting issue that, which means that especially for the 39ers, very few of them ever get back to Canada until the war is over, 6 years.
Geoff, just a really short, perhaps 1 or 2 word answer on this from Ron Labrie in Pinoca. He wonders if those censorship reports you've been talking about are digitized and available online at LAC, or do you have to consult in person to get them?
Well, it's a good question, Ron. Hi, Ron. I've got them digitized because I took a whole bunch of pictures. It would be wonderful to see if we could put them online. I will, but the short answer is no. It would be terrific. But with that said, now I shouldn't be too careful. I don't think the Canadiana Online has included those censorship files, but I might be wrong, in which case a lot of time in the archives was wasted. But they're really good because they do give us a sense of so many issues that we just don't talk about. And I think it's a great source of research, especially even for high school students like Ron's.
We've got about 7 minutes left, Geoff, so maybe I'll ask 2 more questions and then we'll wrap things up. Question from Bob Elliott in Milton about perceptions of Canadian soldiers. The common tale in the First World War is that the Germans were quite concerned about the Canadian troops, especially as we get into 1917 and 1918. His question is what did the Germans think of the Canadian Army, 1st Canadian Army at Normandy?
Well, Stacy quotes a Canadian general in his assessment of the Canadians in Normandy, and it's a very curious piece of historical judgment because he doesn't really cite the Canadian. He doesn't say if the German general is up against Canadians. He wasn't, if memory serves. And he argues, as so many German generals did once they were captured and in the safety of Allied interrogation, that the Americans, the British, the Canadians were all too slow. They were too tied to their artillery, and they really do create a kind of view of themselves that will it becomes remarkably convenient in the post-war. And Terry goes into this certainly in Fields of Fire. You know, the view of the generals, the other side of the hill, Liddell Hart's analysis was very much then, I think, part of the way in which the Canadians were being assessed. And the Germans then were largely trying to prop up their own reputations by arguing that the Canadians, the British, the Americans were too slow. And that created a whole debate within, you know, SLA Marshall's fictitious studies, ultimately, as were found out later, about how to deal with the problems in the American forces, were based on a set of data that Marshall in large measure made up, and yet that stuff still persists. So all sorts of ways in which we have to be careful about how we use the German generals' assessments of the Canadians and the Allies in general.
Got a question from Mark. He's coming in from Mississauga. His question is about the impact of commanders on soldiers' morale. He asks, was Crerar right to push back against Monty in regards to Dieppe and other aspects of the war? Ultimately, Monty got Simons, his choice as leader, and then goes on to ask which Canadian commander was better and did either have a major impact on morale of Canadian troops.
Boy, oh boy, Mark, good questions. Yeah, it's true that that it's generally accepted that Guy Simonds is a better operational commander, and Guy Simonds was enacting Army command through much of the Scheldt battles, and we know that through much of the Scheldt battles, in which the Canadians are being given this huge list of tasks without any commensurate supplies, that Simonds, who was a kind of favorite of Monty's, would never ask for more resources. And so, you know, the Canadians in the Scheldt, let's hope we might have a discussion about this come the fall, Simonds wasn't going to stand up to Montgomery, whose, you know, actions elsewhere are of enormous import, not only for the future of the war, but for the Canadians. So it's interesting that as much as Crerar is not a tactical leader, he is fairly quiet in his interventions. But in that instance that I briefly described, he decides that he is going to have to push back against Montgomery, who doesn't fully recognize the kind of quasi-independence of the Canadian Army. And so as a Canadian, I guess I applaud him. I don't think that would have happened under Simonds, as is demonstrated during the Scheldt battles later on through the fall of 1944. So each had their own skill sets. But in that instance, I think it was one of the highlights of Crerar's career that he was able to stand up to the British. And yet, I think the implication is that in many ways, the British verdict of the Canadians persists. Oh my goodness. Lots of really good questions here from Mike Duffy about Paul Hellyer. Sorry, Mike, I'm not sure if I can answer some of these. Such good questions all, and my forgive us, but we're mindful of time, and we're mindful of that I've gone on far too long, and that you've been very patient with me. So hopefully you can get in touch with me at my email or however way we can, and perhaps you can let us know too if you're wanting to see a series like this continue through the fall. Eric, are you going to say thank you and all those good things?
Yes, I'm going to send us off. But yes, if there are any questions that folks had that did not get answered, you'll get that follow-up email from us thanking you for attending tonight, and you can just respond to that email. Send us an email at admin@canadianmilitaryhistory.ca. You'll see it right in that email, and I can forward those along to Geoff But unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for tonight, and also for the Maple Leaf Route webinar series this summer. Before I close, I have a number of people, quite a number of people. It's been a real team effort, putting together this series, that I'd like to thank before closing. First of all, of course, I'd like to thank General Mark Lassard, Colonel Christian Rousseau, and Brigadier General David Patterson of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation. Without their support from the very beginning of this series, we simply couldn't have put this series on as we have without them. So thanks to those three for their contributions. Second of all, I'd love to thank all of the groundwork that Alex Fitzgerald Black, Mary Eve Vaillancourt, and Kate Carlson have done for us over the last couple of months at the Juno Beach Center Association, helping us get the word out to people literally around the world. So thank you to all three of you, and also all your work on social media has really been able to kind of expand the breadth of our audience, which has been just fantastic. Third, I'd like to thank my team at the Laurier Military Center, and in particular, Raluca O'Preen and Kyle Falcon, for their exhaustive work creating social media content, advertising, and helping me plan and implement the series. Geoff just sent me an email earlier on today finding a ad in the San Francisco Canadian Legion, which was pretty cool and speaks to the work that Raluca and Kyle have done in getting the word out to folks. I couldn't have done this series without their help. Fourth, I'd like to thank, of course, all of our speakers. You know, you got Terry, Mark, Lee, Sarah, Alex, Carol, and Matt, and of course tonight, Geoff, for generously giving your time or giving their time throughout the spring and summer, and providing us with the content that we need to make this series happen. Without them, we couldn't have done this. And lastly, of course, I got to thank you all for tuning in. It's been a long summer, I think, for many of us. And we hope that this series has been a welcome distraction to all of the noise and stress that has surrounded us for the last year and a half during this pandemic. We hope that we've been able to lull you into a wonderful kind of dream of military history, at least for a few hours every few weeks. And lastly, this is my last chance to ask if you feel that you've enjoyed and benefited from tuning into this series throughout the summer at any point. We do hope that you'll donate to both the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association, because it's their work that allows us to keep the memory alive of Canadian troops who fought during both world wars, both fought and died. So of course, just as always, visit our website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar. I know I've sent a lot of notes to people tonight, but at the very top, I have I've included our website, and you just got to go to the top of the page and click donate to whoever you want, and we hope that you will. Other than that, Geoff, if you want to say any last few words about the series, otherwise we can send it home.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick thanks to our CBF alumni who helped us out. And again, if there's any interest in seeing a series like this continue, there's so many issues into the fall of 1944. I'd love to be able to bring other First and Second World War historians onto this kind of platform. And so please let Matt or I know, and we will see if we can organize more Zoom meetings. Can you imagine? At some point we'll all be live, but until then we're still Zooming. So we'll see how we go.
That's right.
Thanks.
Well,
thanks, Eric.
Geoff, thank you very much for being a gracious co-host throughout the spring and summer. It's been a lot of fun.
And you, thanks for all your help, Eric. Appreciate it so much.
No problem. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your night, and we will hopefully see you again very soon. Take care.